Okay, so positive deviance involves several mental somersaults. We do these mental somersaults to ask an improbable, life-giving question. Now, we are going to do mental somersaults with three people. Let's call them three giants, giants on whose shoulders we stand. And they are giants in many ways, but I think most importantly, and this has been mentioned before, they are giants because they have an ethical, moral character that we all aspire to. Now, Lincoln, some of you may know, was tall, and he always loved wearing his stovepipe hat. So, that would make him a 7-footer. There's a story of Lincoln once being asked, Mr. President, you're tall. And this was a petty soldier who was shaking his hand. And he asked Mr. Lincoln, how tall are you? And if it were somebody else, perhaps the response would be, I am 6'4" tall, or I am 6'4.5" tall. And that is what we expect from those who know, who have a certain vernacular, a certain language, a certain expertise. We are so precise when it comes to height. However, Lincoln's response, without batting an eyelid, to a question that was, Mr. President, you're tall, how tall are you, was, son, like you, tall enough that my feet reach the ground. What Lincoln is saying, that there is wisdom in the common ground. Some of you know, I had a long-standing correspondence relationship with Mother Teresa. And the story of Mother Teresa that is relevant here is when she was in Washington, D.C. in 1974 at Dulles Airport. There were about 1,000 people who walked up to her with placards. They were planning a march in Washington, and they asked her mother, will you march with us against the Vietnam War? And there was a long silence. And Mother then said, my child, if you're going to have a march in Washington against the Vietnam War, I am so sorry. But my child, if you were to choose to have a march in Washington for peace, I will be the first to lead. Here's the father of the Indian nation, Rashtrapita. We also called him Bapu, lovingly, father. And of course, the world also called him Mahatma, a great soul. And the father of the Indian nation, if you look to the top left of your screen, in a train coach, always traveled by third class. You're the father of the Indian nation, you should go first class. And Bapu's response always was, I travel third class because, as you know, there is no fourth class. Too often as problem solvers, we begin by identifying with what we are up against. What's the problem? What are the gaps? What are the deficits? What is not working? We should always ask the somersault question. What are we for? What are the assets? What's working? Too often we get all caught up in best practices. Nothing wrong with it. What Gandhi is saying is, if you could factor in the fourth class and their perspective and their point of view in the calculus that you have for problem solving, you will be at a different place. You will be at a life-giving place. Let's see how we can bring these 3 triple somersaults to ask a question, as Gary said, a life-giving question, because life is always there. A question that has never ever been asked before. A question that was asked in 1990s by Monique and Jerry Sternin to address the issue of malnutrition in Vietnam. And this is my favorite picture of Jerry, because whenever you sat across from him, he always did these flips, no? And basically he's saying, flip, flip, do that somersault. And the question was simply, question that had never been asked before, are there children under the age of 5 from very poor rural households the kind of ones where you expect malnutrition to be rampant, that are well nourished. And the answer, out of 3,000 kids in 4 communities that they started out with, yes, there's some 24 children. Among the 3,000, that's less than 1%, the positive deviance because they are not the norm. The norm is that if you have those conditions, you are malnourished. Positive because they have solved the problem. And of course, if you want to bring in the very poor rural households, is Gandhi's 4th class, that are well nourished, is Mother Teresa's "What are you for?" We are for nourishment. What is it that's uncommon that they do? And it was the community who actually went out to self-discover that. And of course, these uncommon practices, in order for them to have any value, for them to be life-giving, need to be accessible to all. So this is what was found in Vietnam. It's a complicated story and it's very well documented, but I'm going to give you some highlights. They found out that amongst these children who were well nourished, who shouldn't have been, their mothers would take the sweet potato greens. Now, we all know the sweet potato. In fact, when we use language, we are interested in the sweet potato. We do not think about the greens. The greens are usually fed to the cows and goats and, or, used as compost. In this case, the mothers of these well-nourished kids were adding the greens of sweet potato to their meals. The mothers were also adding, and this was non-normative, they were taking these teeny tiny shrimps and crabs that grows in rice fields and shellfish, which were not considered to be human food. And they would pick these up, and of course they were there for the plenty, and come back home and remove the crust and have a little pulp and a little protein. Again, adding the greens and the sweet, adding the greens of the sweet potato and adding these little shrimps and crabs were non-normative practices. But the resource was now located by asking an improbable question. Another thing that they found was that kids who were well nourished, who shouldn't have been, were actively fed by their mother. And if a mother wasn't around because she was working in the field, they were actively fed by a sibling. The normative practice was that if a child could sit, and if you are a few months old or maybe a year, you get a bowl of whatever and you eat some and you waste some and you leave some and you drop some, active feeding made sure that the child got the last grain. And more importantly, perhaps, it created an ethic of care around the child with the caregiver, the mother, and the siblings that several times a day manifest itself in the act of connecting with the child through active feeding. Now, how were these practices adopted once you discover this wisdom? And here there is another flip in positive deviance. In positive deviance, you don't tell people. You don't show them. You basically create the conditions for them to practice. So cooking sessions were held where women were invited to pick up tiny greens from sweet potato plants and tiny shrimps and crabs and bring them to the cooking session where they would cook, practice, where they would feed their children, where they would actively feed their kids. They were the ones who tracked their child's progress. And this is what happened in Vietnam, that number going up. It's a very well documented case. Researchers at Emory University, I know several of you are there from Emory. Vietnam was a test case. It worked quite beautifully. The approach has been refined. The deviating practice, which has led to well-nourished kids, is evidence itself.